on the internet and in the digital economy, and just say that, you know, it's going to be essential that we address these challenges, but we really believe they need to be addressed in a way that's consistent with our values that have been so important for people around the world. So thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for a good start. Michelle, let me turn it over to you. I know CDT has been very involved in this, and you've done some groundbreaking work on wearables and thinking other things about the Internet of Things. So why don't you tell us more about that?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. I'm thrilled to be back at the Internet Governance Forum, where I first began my career, I guess, 10 years ago or so. It was my first public speaking engagement, and I spoke about cloud computing, and it was memorable because I was heckled for the first time, which is a valuable experience, let me tell you. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, listen, I can take it. I'm ready. So I think, as Dan mentioned, I'm the acting director of the Privacy and Data Project at CDT. And if you don't know CDT, we're a 20-year-old national nonprofit technology advocacy organization. So we try to instill democratic values online. We have projects in security and surveillance, internet architecture, freedom of expression, open internet, see if I can remember them all, global human rights. So we try to really cover the gamut, and it's heavy work, and it's really rewarding work, actually. So the privacy team, our goal is to investigate and understand technology that empowers and sort of advance the technology that empowers individuals, facilitating individual dignity and autonomy, protecting privacy, protecting freedoms online. We try to sort of not just understand emerging issues, but really speak to existing issues like Internet of Things. There's a lot of emerging parts of Internet of Things, but a lot of it, as Alan mentioned, have been around for a while. Some of these issues have sort of plagued the internet and have been very difficult questions, and those are the questions that we like to ask, and those are the questions that we like to investigate. In the past year, our team has worked on health quite a bit, and that's been an issue that I've led. So health, of course, is an integral component to the Internet of Things when you're talking about wearables or activity trackers, but also when you get into the medical space, medical devices. Nanotechnology is starting to become more and more used, and that includes putting a sensor into your body via a pill. And these things are no longer science fiction. One of the things my family likes to say is my official title is Digital Debbie Downer, I think was it, to make people paranoid. So I will try not to do that with you. But I think more than anything, our goal is to promote awareness of technology as really a facilitation for freedom. Privacy in and of itself is an innovation. It is the reason that we use the internet. Privacy and security are the reason that we go online and can purchase things. And so at CDT, we try to protect those. So we've worked on health and Internet of Things. Also, we have a big project in digital decisions. And that's a really important groundbreaking project. It's looking at the algorithms that fuel the internet. So these are the sort of math equations fueled by big data that decide what the internet looks like for me versus what it looks like for you. And a lot of people, may be surprised to know that it doesn't look the same for each of us. And we have been looking at ways to make these algorithms transparent and fair, which is kind of a loaded word, but the idea being that there is some way to measure risk. There's some way to measure whether or not the impact on people, the decisions that are being made about what you see and what you can do, that those are fair, and that those are in your best interest for the most part. So we also have a project on broadband in Section 222, and we have also worked on drones. So you can kind of see there's a wide breadth of work that we do in it. So I'll focus back in on health and Internet of Things just briefly, and I'll try to sum up a really exciting project that we just finished. This was a collaboration with Fitbit. Has anybody heard of that company? Yeah, anybody have a Fitbit? Let's see, it's always interesting. Not that many people. Okay, I don't. I feel like maybe just doing this project, they should have sent me one, but they didn't. But it was a really great, really interesting project funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. A key component Working with a company is fraught when you're an organization like CDT, even though we have a great reputation and ability to convene stakeholders. But to do a project of this sort of deep dive type, we needed to have a third-party funding source. And so the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has done a lot of innovative work in health and health IT. So we approached them, and what we wanted to do, and I don't know how familiar you are with the advocacy world, but a lot of people have done work on best practices, on principles. A lot of people sort of will put out work that's important, but it doesn't necessarily take the ball further. And it's risky to do that if you're an advocacy organization, because you rely on funding, you rely on impact, and you're not sure if you do something different if that's going to happen. But we decided to take a risk this year and try to do a new kind of advocacy. We worked with Fitbit really intensely to map their internal research and development. So instead of looking at sort of the third-party data flows, how data is flowing in advertising and marketing, which is a lot of what you'll hear in the media, a lot of what advocates will focus on because it's crucial, we decided to see if we could come up with sort of recommendations based on how a company approaches their internal R&D. And so internal R&D is the engine of growth, right? Especially for technology companies, especially for startup technology companies, which Fitbit still considers itself, even though they're public. The data that flows is the gasoline, right, that fuels this fire. The data that flows from you, from me, from actually Fitbit employees. The data that they look at decides what Fitbits do, how Fitbits function, how Fitbits collect data, how the company moves forward. What does Fitbit look like in 2 to 3 years? So looking at this specific place in a company was fascinating, to me at least. You know, somebody who's really about words, talking with people who are really not about words, you know, asking questions that they had never thought to ask, because that's just, they're in a world of engineering. So we spent a year and a half working with Fitbit. We mapped this R&D process. All of this can be found on CDT's website in our report. It's on the front page. And what we did was we came up with some surprising findings, one of which was, as I mentioned, a lot of the data that they're looking at in R&D is employee data. So if you work for a Fitbit, you will be asked to participate in a couple projects. It kind of makes sense, right? Especially if you're a researcher and you're working with somebody and you say, hey, can you jump on this treadmill? And I want to kind of figure this out. That's one version of that. Another version is, we have a lot of people at this company who care about health and wellness. Let's harness that to figure out what our users want too. And of course, when you're me and you approach that and you look at that, there are a lot of questions that brings up, a lot of questions about coercion. And anyway, so what we did was we mapped all these different things. We talked with Fitbit researchers. We watched the company go from 6 researchers to 60 in 1 year. We watched the company go from a private company to a public company in 1 year, and all of this was incredibly instructive for this report, because it allowed us to see what happens when a company changes like this, and the importance of sustainable practices. So we came up with recommendations, which I don't think I have time to go into great detail about, but they were in 3 different buckets. The first was individual dignity. And I should mention, we looked at frameworks like FIPS, we looked at the Common Rule, we looked at different ways that people talk about privacy, security, and ethics. And the reason we talked about ethics is because this is health data. And realizing that more than anything, a lot of privacy questions are becoming ethical questions. And what that means is it's subjective, it's contextual, it's not necessarily FIPS-based. So what we did was we put them into these 3 buckets, the recommendations. Individual dignity was the first, which sounds kind of squishy, I know that, but it was an important principle for us to frame all of our recommendations around consent, around when they should ask you if it's okay to use data in a project, which basically we said was anytime it goes outside of what you would reasonably expect. This is a big deal because Fitbit signed on to this. They agreed to this, and they're a huge, they're a market leader. So this resonates, and this is was sort of the innovation that we were trying to do in advocacy. The second bucket was data stewardship, and this was an important frame because we want companies in this space to see themselves as stewards of your data. They aren't just sort of data repositories, they're not silos, right? But they are active participants in this conversation that we're having globally about health, about wellness, about the Internet of Things. So we said, you are a steward of this data, and that means you have responsibilities. Part of those responsibilities are things like allowing data access for people. Now that sounds counterintuitive if you're a privacy advocate. We don't always talk about access. But in the health space, if you're a steward and we know that you can protect data well, you also need to make it available to people. You also need to help them facilitate their own health, right? Empower them. That's a part of empowerment. We also said that they needed to have really formal policies so that the practices that the researchers were doing were sustainable. So we developed rubrics to help the researchers make decisions. We called them pivot points. So when you're going through a project, if you have a question, is this an ethical question? Is this a privacy question? How do I gauge this? We tried to help them come up with a rubric for that decision making. And finally, we looked at the bucket of social good. And this ties all together. But again, the idea is you're not a data silo. You're part of this conversation. And that means making sure that your data sets are representative. A lot of Fitbit users are white and middle class or upper middle class. And that's not okay. Part of the reason that's not okay is because it intrinsically excludes populations that would also benefit from not only the technology itself, but the research that's going on there, the R&D that they're learning. Think about the kind of information that Fitbit knows about us. They know a lot about the human body. They know a lot about human behavior. And they need to share this, and they need to make sure that it's inclusive and representative of lots of different populations. So those were the 3 buckets, and those are the recommendations. I encourage you to look at it and send me feedback, good or bad. And I think I'll leave it at that. I'll suffice to say the Internet of Things is something that we'll continue to work on in the next year or so. And we're also starting to move our advocacy to sort of look at more global issues in the Internet of Things.
Thanks, Michelle. Those are certainly 3 very good foundational principles, and I hope we can the next round of our discussion sort of come back to the work that you're doing and put some meat
Sure.
on the bones of some of that, and then talk about some other foundational issues. So, Ryan, why don't we turn to you? You're our resident academic. I know you. I think everyone on this panel filed a comment at the Commerce Department to Alan, but I was particularly taken by your comment. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you see as the opportunities and challenges?
Happy to. Thank you to Dan. Thank you to IGF for hosting us here, and thank you to all of my fellow panelists for being up here with me. So yes, to start off, as Alan indicated, the Department of Commerce, NTIA in particular, had a call for comments on the Internet of Things, the benefits, challenges, and role for government. The Niskanen Center filed comments in which I made a number of recommendations that I'd like to talk about. But first, I want to discuss generally how I came to the conclusion that I came to. So the Internet, as it was originally conceived, is fundamentally, if I can borrow a phrase from the co-founder of Wired magazine, Louis Rossetto, about connecting human minds to one another. Computers and mobile devices are simply brain supplemental devices that we use in order to communicate with one another. So that was, you can think of it as Internet 1.0, after the Internet was originally commercialized in the early 90s. What we see now with the Internet of Things is sort of the natural evolution of that type of network system, not only to human minds, but to physical objects in the real world. So you can think of the physical world now as becoming something of an information system and a source from which we can draw data as a means of drawing all sorts of new insights about not only the way the world works, but how we can better acclimate ourselves to it, and ways that private firms can actually for better or worse, start to monetize some of that information and provide consumers with a certain degree of certain number of services and products that maybe previously they were not aware that they wanted. So my comments basically recommended that if we consider the Internet of Things to be the next stage evolution of the Internet, then it probably makes the most sense to maintain a certain degree of continuity in government policy as to how it is the government and administrative agencies should actually view the Internet. And so to that effect, I recommended that the NTIA and all federal agencies, in fact, and the next president, whoever that may be, actually embrace the 1997 Framework for Global Electronic Commerce, that was promulgated by the Clinton administration. This is the framework that essentially set administrative policy towards the internet. And there are 5 principles to the original framework. I only took out 4 since the last one dealt very specifically with global e-commerce. So I wanted to focus on 4 general high-level principles the government agencies could use as sort of a 30,000-foot view of how it is they should approach potentially thinking about regulating the Internet of Things. And they go in order of priorities. First, the private sector should lead. 2, the governments should avoid undue restrictions, undue regulatory restrictions on the Internet of Things. 3, where government involvement is needed, the aim should be to support a predictable, minimalist, consistent, and simple legal environment for commerce in order to continue promoting innovation in this space. And 4, government should recognize the unique qualities of the IoT, which sort of goes back to number 2, that is, the government should avoid any sort of undue burdensome ex-ante regulations, and sort of think about how it is current statutes and current agency authorities, such as the FTC Section 5 authority, can actually potentially address all of the potential harms that might result from consumer protection violations and things of that nature. So generally speaking, I think that this is the ideal framework for the government in general to use when looking at the Internet of Things. Now, all of this having been said is not to say that members of civil society and private companies shouldn't work together to try to promote certain best practices as it comes to privacy and security. In fact, I think that a multi-stakeholder process can help to better inform industry standards and incentivize them to engage in self-regulatory mechanisms, because private companies need to understand that, you know, one of the key things that is going to promote the Internet of Things and its growth is the same thing that promoted the growth of the Internet, and that is consumer trust. People have to believe that the systems that they're using and the ecosystem that they're immersing themselves in is trustworthy, because if they don't believe it's trustworthy, they're not going to buy into it. And so we need to think about privacy by design, security by design, and companies, just as the private sector should lead in the space of innovation in the Internet of Things, the private sector also needs to lead in terms of regulating itself, because if they don't, they're going to allow for a lot of gaps in this space that is naturally and probably justifiably going to have to be filled by government agencies. So while I don't think that there's any fundamentally different issues at play with the Internet of Things, we still have privacy concerns, we still have security concerns, I think most of the effective remedies for those concerns can be initiated by the private sector if they do choose to take the lead on this. And again, part of taking the lead on privacy by design, security by design, is actually engaging with organizations like CDT, other civil society organizations, and trying to get the whole picture of what it is they need to do in order to ensure that trust proliferates in this next evolutionary step of the Internet as it did in the original. Things like encryption, that's going to be important for the Internet of Things, just as it was and continues to be for the Internet. There's a whole lot of details and other issues that I'd like to get to, but I'm going to keep my comments pretty limited just for an intro and just say that the key takeaway here, or the too long didn't listen to Ryan version, is flexibility for the future is going to be key here, because this is an evolving and dynamic ecosystem, and if the private sector is willing and able to take the lead to engage in multi-stakeholder processes with civil society and other concerned stakeholders in this process, I think that we can probably actualize most of the immense benefits and opportunities that the Internet of Things will offer us. And if not, then we might have some problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
I can just jump in.
Yeah, jump in.
So, yeah, I'll make 3 points that build on what has been said to date. One is the Internet of Things will be completely transformative. There is the notion that innovation is slowing down, and we were promised a Jetsonian society, and instead what we have are selfie sticks. The Internet of Things will completely dispel that notion. In fact, Ryan, I think it is more than the next iteration of the Internet. I think it's the next iteration of humanity, because innovation is really just a manifestation of human ideas aimed at overcoming our limitations. And so if you can imagine a world where everything physical has a sensor and is connected to a network and connected to us, that's the Internet of Things. There will be industries that we can't even imagine that will get created, and there will be industries that are prolific today that simply won't exist. I was listening to a radio program last night that in, I think, 15 states in the United States, the #1 job for those who only have a high school education is truck drivers. Imagine in 10 years where truck driving is not an occupation because we have fleets of truck that are autonomous. And so that is our future. That is the Internet of Things. It will transform everything. Our ability to find cures will be cut in half. And so the moonshot of finding a cure to cancer will now be feasible. So that's point one. So it can be esoteric, but it should be send a shock wave through you with excitement on what is possible and how we plan for it. The second point is that I'll make is this is an opportunity, and Alan made the point of, as Ryan did, of comparing IoT to the internet. I think this is an opportunity to improve on the internet in ways that we just couldn't contemplate because of what the internet was intended to be. It has become an open network, but it wasn't founded in that way. In fact, it was founded in a very different way. And so the opportunity to make it more inclusive by design through looking at the potential for inclusivity in everything, including data analytics, the opportunity to overcome digital divides that have existed on the internet, the opportunity to think about privacy and security as two sides of the same coin that lead to trust, and to innovate for it from up front is the opportunity that we didn't have and didn't think about when the internet was developed, in part because of the people who were designing the internet. The third thing is, and I can get into who designed it more, some of them will be, like Dave Farber will be speaking later and he can speak to you about it. It was a fairly exclusive group of people, which is not what the internet is today. And so because of the inclusivity, we have the opportunity to make it better. And that is the final point. Whether it is better or not will be dependent upon us. ITI is a collection of, I like to say, of 60 of the most dynamic companies in the world. So from Apple to Zebra, all the companies in between Google, Facebook, Microsoft, HP, Dell, on and on to 60. And we've launched a IoT dialogue with the aim of building on all of the things that the folks on this panel have spoken to about today, with the aim of accelerating success. And success is really making sure that as we work to overcome human limitations through innovation, we're thinking about all of humanity, not particular parts of humanity. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. I think I'm going to count you as a believer in the Internet of Things. That was outstanding. Jeff, why don't you give us the company
Dan.
perspective?
It's great to be here, and I just applaud the IGF for taking on this issue. I agree with my fellow panelists that this really is, in large ways, the future of the Internet, and a lot of the learnings and experiences that we have all drawn from working in the Internet governance process for the past 20 years, I think will serve us well as we look at IoT going forward. AT&T has a very broad perspective on the Internet of Things, and just to give you some example of how early days we really are, we estimate that we have something like 50 million Internet of Things devices connected to our network right now, and that we are one of the industry leaders. You know, the industry estimates are that by 2020 we'll have something like 50 billion, 25 to 50 billion devices on the Internet of Things. So we are really at the tip of the iceberg here, which is exciting. And I also think because of that, it is like the early days of the Internet, and I would echo what Alan and others have said. I think we really are at the time where a framework and a policy approach to the Internet of Things is going to serve us well and avoid, some of the problems that can come up if we regulate and respond to things in a knee-jerk fashion. So I think the Dynamic Coalition's recommendation for a framework, I think while ambitious, is really worth undertaking. And let's go into the Internet of Things, knowing what are the types of things that we want to achieve and promote, and what are the types of problems that we want to avoid. And I just wanted to share a couple of observations along those lines about what we, from what we see in the real world day to day with our business that might inform that. Number one, the Internet of Things is a vastly diverse set of applications and technologies. We have a dedicated Internet of Things group that deals with everything from connected shipping containers to connected cars, connected medical devices, and now increasingly smart cities technologies. So I think the the approach of let's look at things in the real world and figure out what's going to work, as Michelle, as you did with Fitbit, I think we see a lot of that happening, and I think that is a good model to build on, that you can't have a one-size-fits-all solution, especially for things like privacy and security. So, we've seen the car companies get together and develop a really nice set of privacy framework for dealing with connected cars. I think the work that Fitbit and others are doing there. So, I think we need to encourage more of that and find ways to develop these kind of use-specific type solutions that are going to give consumers the trust that they want in these different environments. But it can't be one-size-fits-all, and there are going to be a lot of Internet of Things applications that really don't raise privacy and security issues, like a connected shipping container. The second point, though, is there is an incredible interrelationship of all of these different Internet of Things applications, and to some extent the sum is greater than the parts. And we really view the Internet of Things from a platform perspective of, we have application developers, we have devices connecting to the network. And one of the benefits of that is, consumers have an incredible amount of choice and innovation flowing their way with very low barriers, right? So you can go to the store and do it yourself, home security, or you can buy a home security solution from AT&T, and you can have all your devices increasingly work together in ways that magnify the benefits. So I think we all are starting to manage our homes and our lives through our smartphones and have these interesting benefits that come from having the applications work together. That creates challenges from a privacy and security perspective, and I think especially on the security front, we need to do more to work across the ecosystem end to end to look at these things across traditional silos. So I like to use connected cars as an example. If it's possible that we could have at least 3 regulators involved there. The FCC would be responsible for your AT&T hotspot in the car. The FTC might be responsible for your Apple Play, infotainment center in the car, and the Department of Transportation, would probably regulate the data being collected by the vehicle. And there's a real risk that we could have fundamentally different privacy and security rules established by each of those different agencies. So we need to find ways to kind of cut across that and say, how do we make security work seamlessly across all of those different companies and all of those different types of services, so that we're not ending up in a kind of bifurcated, outdated way of thinking about these issues. So I think the Department of Commerce really has an opportunity, for example, in what it's doing to look across these issues in a horizontal way with the Internet of Things that also is important as well. And then the third point is the Internet of Things is a global phenomenon. It's incredible the amount of services that we see happening outside the U.S. as well. We're supporting connected tractors in Europe, and we're doing these shipping solutions that have to work with GPS and Wi-Fi and over the cellular network, so that they can handle any type of conditions on a ship or on a plane and other things like that. And if we don't have cross-border data flows and some interoperable solutions that work around the world, we're really going to hold back on the growth of the Internet of Things and the true potential that we see. So just like the traditional Internet, it's going to be very important to view this from the perspective of how do we have interoperable global frameworks for the Internet of Things. And again, I think that's why this is such an important topic for the IGF, because we can't view it in isolation geographically any more than we can any piece of the Internet of Things either. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks for a very good sort of opening discussion. What I'd really like to do now is kind of turn. I mean, we've been talking about the IGF and the Dynamic Coalition on the Internet of Things and the framework, and sort of talk about what, some of the principles that we should embrace in that framework that obviously implicate, innovation and beneficial applications of the Internet of Things. But we've heard, even on the panel, discussion of meaningful transparency and accountability, user control of data, education and awareness, the importance of enabling privacy and security and protecting privacy and security and enabling innovation. Alan mentioned, among other things, the importance of interoperability and spectrum and standards. Michelle mentioned, dignity, data stewardship, and social good. Brian mentioned privacy and security by design. I think Dean inspired us the notion of the transformative nature and the Internet of Things being inclusive by design. I mean, that's just a phenomenal. That's really the way we ought to be thinking about this. And Jeff, your point at the end about the end-to-end nature of the ecosystem and the fact that it is a global framework. I mean, that's part of the beauty of the multi-stakeholder process and the work of IGF is that we're trying to break down those silos and reach consensus positions. So there are a lot of principles there, but I'd love to get into more as we think about this. I mean, a framework within IGF. What from the general opening to some of the more specific issues. I mean, what do fellow panelists think about? How do we create a framework, realizing that this is a global. This is not. I mean, we're IGF USA, but I mean this is a global. There's going to be a global benefit. There's a global societal benefit to the Internet of Things, whether it's in the developing world or the developed world, and the issues are sometimes similar and sometimes very different. But I'd love to hear thoughts about how do we get into more of the specifics from our excellent opening comments. But Alan, do you want to take that first?
Well, I guess I would start by saying I think we do need to be careful about not being too prescriptive. I think one of the things we heard all through is that this is still early days. So we may want to think that can be part of a framework. Don't be prescriptive. In fact, in some ways, Ryan's the way that Ryan presented it with the Clinton era framework on electronic commerce is actually might be just exactly the right kind of way to start thinking about this. That we do need to, on a global level, respect the fact that a lot of that this is early days. First, do no harm. A lot of the solutions to these problems are going to come out of the private sector, then start to dig in on, yes, we absolutely need to have trust here. Yes, we want to make sure we have good global standards that work, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves.
I had one comment. I think one of the biggest, maybe philosophical, but also pragmatic questions I think facing the Internet of Things is how to deal with the issue of ownership of the information, control over the devices, control over the data. And the reason I say that is for a few reasons. One is the idea of consumer autonomy in the marketplace is one that we hold fairly close. The idea that there are lots of market factors that are surrounding us as we make purchase decisions. But what happens when all of those factors are different companies that control different parts of a system? How much control do you actually have over that? So, for example, if a bunch of companies are offering services for your Internet of Things in your house, who actually makes the decisions there? Is it you? Because what happens if the company goes out of business? Where does your data go? So it sort of intertwines questions of privacy and security. And I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the sort of next generation of privacy and security are questions like ethics. They're questions like ownership. Interoperability is not just a question of how do we make things work well, that's crucial, but it's also a question of how do we secure them. We're talking about information about people that is finely grained. And when you think about what you do in the privacy of your home and the sanctity of that, what does that mean when that information is shared and monetized by a multitude of different companies in a way that doesn't happen now? This would be much more personal, much more location-based, much more behavioral.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Michelle.
No, I could go on for a while. Go ahead.
Actually, I saw some hands go up, so Dan, I'd be curious to hear what people in the audience think, but two things. One is, some of it is new and some of it is not. When I was riding home yesterday, the not new part, there was a conversation about what happens to all the data that Bernie Sanders has collected now that he's endorsed Hillary Clinton. Does that automatically go to Hillary? That's not necessarily an Internet of Things issue. It's the broader ethical questions that we face as human beings. Just they will be confronted with them more often. I also think that there are opportunities to think anew because of the Internet of Things about these sorts of issues as well. For example, in the same way that I donate blood, will I now be able to donate data that can help to find cures? Our companies, I know, are not structured to confront those things because we don't employ a lot of ethicists, right? But it seems as if moving forward with the Internet of Things, we'll need to confront these ethical issues in the same way that others in other sectors have, for example, in healthcare.
Just a quick comment is that I think the way maybe to achieve the balance that Alan was mentioning about not being overly prescriptive is, let's establish the proactive principles that we want for the Internet of Things. And I think things like inclusion and what trust and ethics, those are all things that we want to build in from the beginning. But let's be really flexible in terms of how we achieve that and embrace some of the innovative things like multi-stakeholder that I think have been lessons from the Internet, and kind of know going in that we're going to look for how we solve these issues in a flexible way. And I use drones as a great example. The administration made a conscious choice to say we're not going to have the FAA try and do privacy, which they, far outside of their scope of expertise. Instead, let's have a multi-stakeholder process and see if we can address this with a more diverse group of inputs. And I think it was a very successful approach there. So that's, I think, maybe a combination of really core principles and that we want, as well as some thoughts on how to achieve it in a way that's going to be flexible and dynamic. Could be the type of balancing that we can do without being overly prescriptive.
I guess just to jump in one last time, since I'm the last person to speak on this issue, maybe one idea. Well, first off, I agree with what everyone said. I mean, first off, the key here is trying to build out some sort of framework that everyone from all different sectors of the economy and society and the global community can generally agree on as best practices for a framework as it relates to how we think about the Internet of Things, and that's great. In terms of some of the issues Michelle raised, these are big issues that I don't actually have a solid answer to. Some of what I read is very fond of the idea of moving away from sort of use-based limitations on data collection, or moving away from a notice and consent regime towards a use-based limitation on what we do with data. Maybe that's the right way forward. I don't actually know, though. And I think because so few of us can actually say that we have all the answers to all of the myriad concerns that we all share when it relates to the Internet of Things, makes the need for a general multi-stakeholder process where we bring together all the people who maybe do have those local sets of knowledge, from engineers to privacy advocates to folks from the government, from DOC to members of civil society, and talk through where the fault lines are and kind of come up with a general agreement where everyone can, say, this is good, we can all live with this. So compromise politics is the art of the possible, the usual.
Since somebody had mentioned Jeff had mentioned the multi-stakeholder processes, I will just say, that is actually a place where we could see a role for government as an instigator, convener, creator, sponsor of multi-stakeholder processes to try and develop good practices in some of these areas. We recently did something around drones and privacy, as Jeff mentioned. we're keenly interested in ideas about other places where a multi-stakeholder process could play a beneficial role in this space. So, for example, something like, we've talked a little bit about security. One of the big issues that keeps coming up is the question of field upgradability of devices, especially some of these devices that are only intermittently connected to the internet, where a user may have no idea about the fact that they need to download a security patch for their device, and what are the best practices around that. That's just like an example of a kind of place where you could imagine a multi-stakeholder process creating a set of leading practices that people could look to just as a start, because we hear about this, we hear these kinds of questions from industry all the time. What are we supposed to do here? And there's in a lot of cases not great guidance out there. So that could be a role, and we'd welcome the thoughts on where we could help.
Well, and just to pick up on what Alan was saying, and to reiterate what I said at the beginning, I mean, we've been working within IGF, within the Dynamic Coalition on the Internet of Things since 2008, and really began to develop, through a series of meetings over the last couple of years, but to develop a voluntary framework, which we socialized at last year's IGF and again at Eurodig and a little bit today, but in Mexico. So I mean, it's a process. Like with any process, any multi-stakeholder process, it takes some period of time for it to mature and ripen. But I think we're getting to that point with the Internet of Things. But before we go to the audience questions, because I see that there are a number, I just want to exercise my prerogative. Actually, I want to go back to you, Dean. I'm having
Sorry.
having
What's your question?
having worked on the Internet of Things since 2004, I'm just completely captured or taken by your comment about the Internet of Things is really being inclusive by design. And so that's a notion, that's a notional framework, and I know you've done a lot of work at ITI with this dialogue, and you gave an example about some of the ethical issues. I'd love to hear more thinking about what inclusive by design. We've all talked for so many years about privacy and security by design, but inclusive by design, really that just captures so many. It's so much broader, and it's so much more transformative. I'm just wondering how you see what your vision for that is.
So I'll be honest, no clear vision, but I'll share a story that I probably shouldn't, but came from one of our companies, so I won't mention their name. So in this tech company, they decided that they were going to go to a system for their lunchroom where everything would be ordered by computers, touch screens in the cafeteria. And in doing so, they realized less people were coming to lunch and eating in the cafeteria. And so they went deeper on it, on why that was the case. And it turned out that there were lots of folks who needed more time to order, or who had questions, who they were embarrassed to slow things down in the cafeteria to find someone to ask those questions to. And so they went back to the drawing board, and what they've decided it's not just adding more people, but giving people an opportunity to order from their desk in advance of lunch, right? So your computer is now connected to the entire system. That may seem, pretty simple. Why didn't they think about that from the start? But the analytics of the data that comes from sensors is being done by people. Mm-hmm. And so and there are lots of examples that have gender and racial overtones to them, but to the extent that design decisions are not being made in ways that are consistent with all of us, then you end up with particular products or services that don't reflect all of us. And so the Internet of Things is an opportunity to begin to address that in a way that we didn't think about with the Internet. And some of that may be cafeteria, some of it may be privacy and security and building trust, because we have a much better sense of it from 30 years or 30 plus years of dealing and functioning with the internet. And so I think it's an opportunity to truly make innovation reflective of what innovation is, right, which is overcoming our limitations.
Great.
Just a couple of
Jeff.
other examples. A lot of health IT, Internet of Things are going to be, enormously helpful to elderly and other sick people. So, we have slippers with sensors built in if you're in a nursing home, and actually by analyzing how somebody walks, you can anticipate that they're likely to fall or that they're likely to have other medical conditions. And, you can put sensors in a pill cap, so if somebody doesn't take their pill, it sends the doctor a text. So incredible things there. And then I think of another example of, some cities have done traffic analysis to look at commuting patterns, and they found that sometimes low-income people have to travel an enormous distance to work, and they didn't have good public transportation options. So you can, adjust where you're providing bus service and things like that to actually deal with based on an informed basis rather than maybe a stereotypical view of what people are doing. So,
Yeah, even on
really interesting real-world examples.
So the slippers, so some 60+% of injuries to people over 65 happens in their home, and over 50% of those happen at night. And so if you could have slippers with sensors that turns on the light when an elderly person gets out of the bed, think about the implications, right? And so
You should go build that.
Yeah,
That's a good
but
idea.
I know, am I sharing it with the world? Danny, we need to leave right from here and get on that. But if those people aren't a part of the design process, then you're not thinking about that up front. Right?
And that's the problem with a lot of the big data systems, is that the people really aren't. People are creating the algorithms that are, doing the data analytics that make decisions about what kind of products and services that we have. But they make a lot of mistakes, and they have a lot of inherent bias. And so one of the tricky parts, I think, of the Internet of Things is this transparency component, but I don't mean it in the traditional sort of notice and consent, but it's building in the human perspective right from the start and having the sort of feedback loop from people to be able to say, hey, this isn't right. This isn't, not how I wanted this service to work. I don't have access to this service for different reasons. That kind of transparency sounds very simple, but it does not exist today. And a lot of the reason is companies are, hesitant to reveal sort of proprietary algorithms, and really, if they showed us the math, it wouldn't help us. What we need are mechanisms for accountability and ways to assess when the impact and the data uses are harmful.
Yeah, sorry. Alan.
No, go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to, we talked about ethicists earlier. In general, in our world, peer review is not a part of what we do, right? But in the medical world, it is, right? So when we are now, and that's part of the excitement of the wholly new industries that will get created, because as a part of tech, more and more our companies are, as you saw with Fitbit, thinking about ethicists, and they're thinking about peer review in a way that we just haven't. It's part of our growth.
That's a really good idea. I like that idea, the peer review idea. Part of the recommendations we made for Fitbit was that they needed to publish the results, that they needed to participate in more peer review. And again, a company is hesitant. A lot of their products and a lot of the data is proprietary. But encouraging them to think of themselves as this data steward meant publishing and making these things public, and that of course also means peer review. So there's a lot of thinking right now about ethics and research and what it means to have something like an institutional review board, an IRB, which is the way that academic research goes through to be reviewed for ethical considerations. Maybe part of the component here is updating that to reflect the tech industry. That would be interesting, I think. Sorry.
The only other slightly additional riff on this is about the importance of the openness of data and the openness of platforms in all of this, so that we can support a kind of broad ecosystem of innovation. I mean, the reason the iPhone is interesting because Apple isn't the only one making apps for it, right? It's a platform for people making apps. The question of whether we can build systems where we're not prejudging how they're going to be used, where there's openness in the platforms, where we make data available. This is something that the government can really help with in terms of making data sets available so that they can be used by lots of people. That's another way to approach the concerns about bias in algorithms, bias in the applications that we create, is to create the conditions where people can do things that are surprising.
Great. Well, and just one more riff before we go to questions. I mean, Jeff mentioned this earlier about the industrial internet, or what we think of as the efficient internet, and this is we're having a fabulous discussion, and we're looking forward to Q&A. But we're also talking, I mean, most of the issues that we're talking about affect the developed world. So, part of it is to get your head around the applications of the industrial internet in the developing world when it comes to the smart grid or smart agriculture. I mean, in places where, a 1%, and this is modest, but an increase in efficiency in the electric grid, or an increase, 1% increase in a crop yield, or, with respect to water, that makes a significant difference in the lives of millions and millions and millions of people. And that's also the beauty of having this discussion, I mean, making it multi-stakeholder and having it within IGF. So, but let's have a number of questions.
Good luck.
So, gentlemen in the back, please identify yourself and your affiliation, and then we'll take other questions. And try to keep we have about 25 minutes, so let's try to keep our questions short, and we'll try to keep our answers short, and we'll get to as many as possible.
So, thank you, Dan. I'm Jim Galvin with Affilius, and I was struck by a comment that Michelle made in her introduction in the beginning. She was talking about when working with the Fitbit folks, finding that as part of developing the report, you were asking questions they hadn't thought of in putting all that together. And then I'm listening to everyone else, and it reminded me that in the category of managing risks of Internet of Things, we often frame our discussions about security and privacy in what I'll characterize as a positive way. So we talk about the fact that we want to protect access or control of the data. We want to define who the owner is. You want to encrypt it as it's data in motion. I think that Alan actually started to touch on the side of things that I wanted to get to when he talked about what happens when the technology is obsolete, okay, and it's no longer relevant. What I worry about in talking about security and privacy is we're discussing it in the context in which we understand it, right? Dean talked about the internet being transformative, the Internet of Things being transformative, and we're going to jump into a whole new generation. The internet started where everybody knew everybody, right? So you really didn't need security and privacy because we all work together. We've sort of evolved into really wanting that. What's going to happen going down the path? I want to suggest that we reframe the discussion and the context of our discussion of security and privacy, and I'm interested in what the panelists think about this. I think we lose sight of the fact that we're working in a hostile environment. That's the difference. And we don't think about our security and privacy in the context of working in a hostile environment. I would assert that obsolete technologies are now very much in a hostile environment. Technologies that become orphaned are now very much in a hostile environment. You talk about your slippers and turning on the lights. Well, they're working in a hostile environment, right? I mean, maybe the home itself or the assisted living facility is open, but how is that protected from the outside world, right? We've all heard and seen stories about the child monitors, that suddenly you can go find them on the internet, and now other people can listen to your kids or, perhaps even see your webcams. Anyway, the context of shaping our security and privacy discussions, the management of risks in the context of a hostile environment, I think is what's missing in these discussions. And I'm interested in what the panelists think about that. Thank you.
I'll let others, I think, speak on this, but I can say, for example, I've been speaking a lot about Pokemon Go. I assume I don't have to explain what that is, since it has taken over the entire world. The questions that I get are a lot about privacy and security, and it is with the context of this hostile world, right? And I agree with you. I think in some ways the idea of security can be very benign. It can be sort of sanitized by policy discussions, when in fact we're talking about hackers, we're talking about a huge network of criminals who are looking for any opportunity. And Pokemon Go, of course, is a huge opportunity in lots of ways. It's a big target, and it's also a big target on kids, I should say. So, I think that that's a very real frame, and I'm glad you brought it up. When we worked with Fitbit, we talked about security a lot. Fitbit's really good, just so the people who they do a really good job on security. They understood from the beginning, and part of the reason they understood from the beginning that security was not just about protecting data, but about keeping bad actors out, is because the people who built the products had worked in IRBs. They had gone, a lot of people there, for example, had a lot of degrees. They'd gone through IRBs. People had done a lot of work on medical devices. So the experiences that they had with that meant that security was about life or death. It was about somebody's safety. And so that was built into the product right from the beginning. So how to do that, I think, in part, we made that a part of our recommendations, but I think it's a difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, we think about security every day. It's a core to our business. But I think a couple of things that I think we can do, Jim. One is I think technology can be part of the solution. And Alan, you mentioned upgradable security. We're working with the automakers on over-the-air updates to security patches, so you don't have to go to a dealership and get a USB plug-in for the patch or for the upgrade. So that's the kind of thing that I think we need to be thinking about technically to help make this more seamless, but it takes working across a lot of different companies and types of providers. The other is, just real quick, the other is an education challenge with these small innovative companies, and Fitbit is kind of moving into bigger, but how do we do a better job of getting good information and more standardization of security for the smallest types of companies and the really innovative that are just building quick and getting something out quick and trying to kind of just be first to the market, maybe not thinking enough about security. I think we should all try and find ways to help them understand what they need to be doing. So.
I'm just going to flag just real fast the pace of change issue here. And Michelle mentioned, Pokemon Go. I think it was released 8 days ago, maybe. And now it goes without saying that we all understand what Pokemon Go is. I think this is just going to be a huge challenge in terms of consumer education. How do you create a culture of security for people in the face of this kind of crazy pace of change? And I just will totally underscore Jeff's point. I mean, if we're going to do good privacy by design, it's got to be, and security by design, that is a key here. We've got to help industry do that, and that's a lot of the small and medium-sized companies that don't have giant legal shops.
And then just, real quick, when we are framing it in terms of privacy and security, there's also a cost-benefit analysis that needs to go into this. It's not the case that every single type of data that's collected by every single sensor in every single context is equally important, is equally valuable, deserves the equal amount of protection. It's the case that with many RFID passive sensors, encryption probably isn't even required at all because it's not collecting any degree of sensitive data. So context is important in this, but so is cost-benefit analysis when it comes to, again, the benefits versus the costs, and then actually assessing actual harms versus actual benefits, which is a difficult thing to assess, especially if you're a federal regulator. So I wish them well with it, but I don't have any suggestions.
Jonathan, it's a microphone.
Jonathan Lichman from the Providence Group. I want to ask another question about security, but in a very different way. So first, just a quick observation. When we talk, and Michelle did a great job, when we talk about privacy now, the discussion over the past few years has really evolved and matured, so we're really talking about ethical considerations and things that are very deep. When we talk about security, and it's my observation even on this panel, we really talk about IT, technical security. And there's an ethical dimension to security, and there's a much larger security dimension to the whole ecosystem. So recent study came out on medical devices or computer access in medical the field. And it's pervasive that people write their passwords and usernames and put it on a sticky and put it on medical devices so people can get easy access to it. But there's an ethical dimension to that, especially when patient care comes or can be negatively affected by that. So at what point do we begin to deepen the conversation on the security side of this ecosystem so it's beyond just IT security?
That's a great point. I mean, the Pokemon Go, in addition to the data issue, is having issues of physical safety of people using it. Those are much harder to deal with in some ways. Drones, another issue. I wasn't surprised to have a data collection discussion about privacy, but the concern about physical intrusion of flying over your home and are the drones labeled, that's a much more challenging issue that is kind of beyond the traditional internet technology. So, these are physical world devices, and we're going to have to think that way as well as about data. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think how we talk about these things and the education we engage in, for example, there's a general notion that if you are, your risks are greater if your communication is moving through the ether by Wi-Fi. And that's just not real. It's counterfactual, in fact. And so there's a lot of that work that we need to mature the conversation, I guess is the point, and do the education that's coordinated with that.
Yeah, good question. This gentleman over here.
My name's Dan Werner from the Marshall McLuhan Global Village. My name's Dan Werner from the prospective Marshall McLuhan Global Village Awards. I have a question about the driver of the Internet of Things, and I'm assuming that the driver of the Internet of Things is simply capitalism, and that all these nice words about ethics and privacy and all that good stuff, basically what's going on is we have a series of products that are being sold and make sense. The slippers that work, that's proprietary information for whoever it is who made the slipper technology. The medical information that you come up with is sold to hospital systems so they can compete against other hospital systems. And virtually there may be common ground in the Internet of Things that we can talk about privacy and social good and all that kind of stuff, but aren't you really sort of behind the screen? Aren't we really talking about corporate interests that are want to control the access to the information? And if there is going to be privacy, it's going to be because they want to keep it to themselves so they can sell it. And there's nothing wrong with this, by the way. I'm not against it. I'm just sort of saying, isn't there another truth behind what the social consciousness that you're talking about here?
Dean.
Am I the corporate stooge on the stage? Yes. Let me step forward. I think that the way that you said it at the end, which is "and," is true. So one of the things that's real about the world in which I work, which is tech, is that mostly what we do is we endeavor to solve problems and earn a living solving those problems. And so there is an altruistic element of it, which is there are real human limitations that we all want to overcome, whether it's an elderly person or otherwise. But it is in part done to solve those problems. And then can you achieve scale and make money? So it is truly an and. I think part of the dynamic thing about Michelle's work and what's happening in our world is more and more the world is demanding that we think broadly about technology, because it's no longer a corner case, the thing that wonks and nerds like myself deal with, but it is something that is in front of all of you. And so because of its dispersion, we have to deal with broader societal issues in a way that we just didn't do before, which I think is a net good.
I agree with that, and I also would add that I don't agree. I think I'd push back a little on the idea that it is just a commercial proposition. And the reason I would say that is evidenced probably every day. Here's a good example. When somebody takes a video of the police doing something, and who owns that video? The reality, right, is that it goes to the cloud and that company owns that video. But when it's posted on a social media platform, do we own it? Who owns the sort of values that represents, or the actions that occur as a result of it? You know, part of the Internet of Things is a communication that is occurring in society. You know, so the social good, the social consciousness is very real and isn't a commodity, right? Yes, there's an argument for that. You could say that this is all commercial proposition, but I think that fails to sort of see the social good part of this, or maybe just the social part of this. Another example in health. When you have people who have diabetes and who are struggling with their insulin pumps, have become sort of citizen scientists. They have hacked these devices to create these amazing devices that solve some of the problems. For example, they can sleep through the night without having to wake up and take insulin. But what the problem that they have is getting access to data, is getting access to their own data from companies. right? So that's a commercial proposition, but it speaks to a much larger social question about, and that's part of why I connected privacy and ownership and the Internet of Things, because I think the reason that it matters is because it's a social question, a broader social question. If that makes sense.
Other questions? Yes, sir. In the back. Wait for the microphone.
It's right behind you.
Thank you. I'm David Sorokin with Team Rocket. I've been wondering about the bandwidth implications of the Internet of Things, and I'm actually surprised that there wasn't much discussion about that. On the one hand, billions and billions of additional devices happening very fast suggests that we're looking at the possibility of real bottlenecks. Maybe in very particular areas like GPS access and things like that. On the other hand, these devices, like my slippers, aren't going to be streaming Netflix, so maybe it's not quite as grave as one might imagine. So I just wonder, the people who are looking 10, 15 years down the road and making the decisions now about what that capacity is going to be, what do they see and what are they trying to address?
I don't know. Do you want to?
I'll just do it quick and then jump in. We do see
There's
that
some
this
great
is
work
going
going on.
this is going to put demands on spectrum, and a couple of things to note. One is, I think you touched on this, it's a very heterogeneous set of devices with different needs. Some devices may just check in once a day, once a week. Others are going to need real-time communications that's going to have to be prioritized for your medical, device. So I think it's part of the spectrum challenge is thinking about accommodating a dizzying array of different applications. But we do see the U.S. government, really doing that, and Alan can talk about this, but I think the U.S. is kind of ahead of many other parts of the world in trying to think ahead to the spectrum needs that the Internet of Things is going to drive. And it's going to be a combination of services. The cellular network will be a piece of the solution, Wi-Fi, short range, Bluetooth type things. So there's a lot of different types of solutions that are going to work for these Internet of Things devices.
I would simply, I think that's excellent. I would simply add, yes, it's a huge issue. It's come up in a lot of the comments we received on our RFC. It's something we're actively looking at. I think Jeff said it very well. There's going to be a wide variety of needs out there, including really high demand needs that need, where we may even need to have dedicated spectrum. You see this, for example, coming up in the connected vehicle area, where there's been a set aside of a set of spectrum to build against, and we're going to have to think about how we think about that in the broad context of needs out there. And I would just simply say, this also speaks to to a broader issue, which is just the need for more spectrum, both licensed and unlicensed spectrum, for all of the needs that are out there for the internet. And we have a goal within the administration of identifying 500 megahertz of new spectrum by 2020 to free up, but we're more than halfway along the way to getting there. And I think that we're going to need to. This just underscores the need for that, and it's going to be, like I say, it's going to be a combination of solutions and needs. It's going to be licensed, it's going to be unlicensed. We're going to have to look at the places where there are special needs, and also interesting technical solutions like shared spectrum and how we can use some of the innovation out there to make better use of the spectrum that's out.
Yeah, I think because it is thanks. I was testifying yesterday or the day before and kept forgetting to do that as well, so good to get the reminder. Part of what is exciting is because it's a scarce resource. The last point Alan was making is that it's forcing a lot of innovation within our companies to motivate deployment of spectrum, but also to use what is available. The U.S. is ahead of the rest of the world. The rest of the world realizes it. And so one of the things that also needs to occur, which is starting to occur, is just greater cross-border collaboration around making sure that the devices that you purchase in one market does in fact function as you travel around the world. So.
Just say from a consumer perspective, it underscores the importance of things like zero rating, like net neutrality, making sure that companies that are so actively competing for the spectrum are recognizing that part of their job, again, is to be stewards of those and to not, do pay prioritization, all of this stuff where basically your ability to do what you want online is sort of limited, which is fine, I think, in a lot of contexts, but making sure that's not about money or access and making sure that the internet remains open.
We've got about
It's a can of worms.
5 minutes, and it looks like we still have a lot of questions. So, right there. But let's try to keep the questions short, or maybe with 5 minutes. Why don't we just sort of ask a collective, if this is okay, just ask a collective round of questions so that you get a chance to ask the question, and then we'll try to wrap it all up at the end, if that works.
I'll try to make it super concise. I've heard basically consensus that consumer trust is going to be the linchpin going forward, that businesses have to build that trust. Businesses don't have the incentive, though, to educate consumers about the risk that they're confronting as they consume these new products. So I would posit that maybe an appropriate role of government would be to engage in more consumer education and empowerment, so that, because I don't think that businesses are there's always that tension between business and government. I work at the Small Business Administration, by the way, sorry. These are my own comments. But there's always that tension, so you never really get an effective consumer protection. So I'm interested in those thoughts.
Okay.
I think that's yeah.
Let's just try to let's get a whole
Get a whole
range
bag.
of questions, and then we can respond one final time.
Two
Yes, sir.
mutually exclusive issues. One is administration. I probably have 10 technology devices in my house, 6 mine, 4 my wife's. When I changed my network name, I had to go around the house fixing all the devices, same as when you go on and off daylight savings time, fix all the clocks. So when I have 100 devices in my house, I wonder about that. But the other issue is turning the coin over on ownership and the idea of the vendors, the car manufacturers, but others too, deciding when it's time to push updates tremendously scare me. Because if you look at all of the people who didn't want to be upgraded to Windows 10, but woke up and found out, surprise, I'm running the new operating system, the idea of coming down to my car and finding out perhaps it's bricked by a bad patch, or that the UI looks different on the screen and I have to study it before I can drive it. Who owns the ability to administer those things? If I have a little gadget that has no buttons, how do I control when the vendor changes the software? And maybe I don't want them to do that. I have all my devices set so I control when I update them. I'm not interested in things being pushed. I want to pull the information. So 2 issues. One is proliferation of administration, and at the same time actually being able to control the administration. So I own the car and I control the updates.
1 or 2 more quick questions. Great point. Yes, Brett.
Brett Berlin from George Mason University. The perfect predicate to what my comment was, I was just thinking back my 45 years, and every 5 years I've been party to this exact same conversation. I believe we have an opportunity right now. And the opportunity is, the problem is, the assumption always was that technology has to change, tell you how to change things. So we viewed technology as the driver, and requirements were technology requirements. Everything's requirements, risks, privacy is all a technology issue. We now have a huge opportunity to take a fundamental change of mind and decide that instead of the human and communities being a victim, why don't we make them the driver of opportunity and perspective, and pick up the opportunity there, because there's huge opportunity, and the internet power is not many to many or many one to many. It is small to small. That's the real power of the internet. And I think we have a huge opportunity to reframe the entire debate.
Great question. With that, we're almost out of time. Let's just do a quick sort of 30-second lightning round. Any from our panelists, just concluding thoughts. Alan?
So just generally, I think these questions about the consumer experience just underscore how much work still needs to be done to work the consumer experience. I think for a lot of consumers, this is going to be a confusing area. You know, to talking about just talking about the security downloads, for example, I feel very much like the questioner. I would like to have a lot of control. My canonical focus group, my mom, would really not like to have control. She just wants it to work, and it will drive her crazy if she has to download 45 security patches and even just to click yes each time to get her refrigerator to work in the morning, right? So, and we are going to want to drive some of these security changes. So I would just say I think this is a giant challenge. It's an industry challenge, but it also is a challenge in the sense that we need to make sure that we've rested a lot on the notions of transparency, notice, and choice control for consumers. If that is going to continue to be our rubric, we need to be working on thinking about the best practices out there, and we need to make these things really work for consumers. And there will be a role for government in explaining what those standards are, and hopefully also in working on the multi-stakeholder processes that can give us some of the best practices. This is really a test case about how we're going to make sure we're looking at a human-centered approach to building these new technologies.
Well, thank you for your attention and for these great questions. I have a lot of thinking to do, I think, just from listening to all of you. The questions of autonomy, the questions of sort of what is our role and how do individuals have control over this information, I think are really crucial right now. There are a lot of different ways to look at them. There are a lot of different roles that you could put sort of commercial entities in government. The truth is all of this is very mixed together now. Even governments, if you think about the Precision Medicine Initiative, you may have heard of, where the White House is trying to get genetic information to sort of precisely target different genetic disorders. They're doing this in some ways through iOSs, right? People can donate their data, and iOSs are very privacy and security aware, but it shows this sort of melding of the data, and I think what it comes down to is, do we want to introduce new ideas, recognizing that privacy matters, but looking at new ideas like data sovereignty, like ownership, and portability, right? The portability aspect, so that you are able to move your data. Yeah, it's a pain, and I get that. Even thinking about having this conversation with my father makes me sweat. It's not, none of these are easy, but I do think that there's a way for there to be more control for people. And that would also include education. That would be a crucial part of not just educating people about how software systems that allow this would work, also educating businesses, helping them build capacity to be able to do this. Now, these aren't short-term kind of projects, but I agree that this is an opportunity to start that sort of from kind of the beginning of the Internet of Things.
Thank you to Dan for moderating. Thank you to IGF again, and also my fellow panelists, and all of you for your great questions. It gives us a lot to think about. Lots of things that we might not have thought about prior. So just in real quick lightning round fashion, yes, absolutely. I think that consumer education is one of the primary roles in which government can actually be an incredibly effective partner with the private sector as well as members of civil society. So 100% agreement. To the UI, UX issues, I agree entirely. The issue that I have in my mind looking forward is I don't know if we're going to be living in a society much longer where we own that many more things. It could just be the nature of existence in 15 or 20, 25 years, that most of the things that we currently think of as capital goods that we would have in our houses or in our garages are simply services that we lease from companies, or maybe services that we lease from one another in sort of peer-to-peer arrangements. I tend to avoid trying to prognosticate about the future as much as possible. But before I was leaving my office today, all of my colleagues reminded me that I should not play the role of the eternal optimist on this panel. So it's great to see that Dean actually took the torch for me. But I will end on what I actually think in terms of how I look at the future. I truly believe that technology is the primary driver not only of human progress generally, but of human well-being. We live in incredibly wealthy, rich, wonderful times. The world is a better place now pretty much than it ever has been in all of human history. And I think that it's important for us to try to see the best in technological progress, even though we occasionally get the Pokemon Go hiccups along the way. I'm not a big fan. I can't believe it's only been 8 days. It feels like a lifetime. Maybe if I jump on it, it'll go by quicker. So I would just say, try to be as optimistic as you can about the future. There are things issues, concerns that we need to deal with the Internet of Things and other emerging technologies that are at the intersection of this nexus area: artificial intelligence, big data, privacy, security, ownership of privacy, how these issues all work themselves out. But generally speaking, I like to think that the future is going to be better than the present, because it certainly is better than the past. Thank you.
So two things. One, the good news is that the companies that I work with are thinking about these issues and confronting them in ways that we just haven't before, which is good and exciting. The second thing is, I think there is a recognition that we don't have all the answers. And so conversations like this are incredibly meaningful, and I hope you will stay engaged and continue to push us to confront the challenging issues that are important to us, but that are also just important to society and the future of humanity. So thanks.
Yeah, great questions, and I think it's obvious you're not just here to collect a Pokemon, so this seems like a very engaged audience. I thought there was a thread of kind of what's the role of government, what's the role of the user, and all of that led me to just, come back to the multi-stakeholder, is why that approach is so necessary, because you can't just have only companies or only governments trying to solve these issues. I think the final question, to me, you touched on the biggest challenge we have as companies with the internet and the Internet of Things is, I can design a very secure system. What is much harder is a secure system that also gives you convenience, choice, flexibility, where I can, with one click of a button, sign up for a new app, share my data with all my friends. That is much more complicated, and I think we're going to have to continue to work through the right balance of when does the system just kind of impose security on you, and when do you pull and make decisions. And then a final thought is, we are ahead of the rest of the world, which is good news. The bad news is I think we see a lot of proposals to kind of take on the U.S. and view it as a big scary thing that is happening, and we really, I think, would benefit from showing leadership on the policy issues as we are on the technology side, to help show that there is a way to address legitimate privacy and security concerns that, while we can still have all the benefits of the Internet of Things. So great that we're having this discussion. Thank you.
Well, with that, thank you for your attention, and let's thank our panel.